We're gonna get going here. It's a little busier than usual here. We're having a joint meeting tonight with the Southampton Select Board, and from the Select Board, I'm John Martin, Francine Tishman, Matt Rowland, Jim Labrie, and Rini Groden coming in, and from the Water Commissioners.
Chair Matt Christie.
Member Kurt Mosley, and Water Superintendent Tom Gaughan.
Great. We're going to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This is being televised and recorded, and just for the record, the Open Space Review Committee is also present. It was posted as an official meeting, so they have a quorum, in case anybody asks. So the first thing on our agenda is the joint meeting with the Water Commissioners, Professor Bob Newton. Do you want to take that, Matt, and give a little intro, or?
Yeah, sure. I'll turn it immediately over to Kurt.
Okay, thank you. In July of this year, July of 2018, the Water Commissioners, while we're working on a lot of things to improve our infrastructure in town, were presented with an opportunity to, or asked if our interest was in acquiring or protecting a large piece of land off of Pomeroy Meadow Road. The total acreage is in the vicinity of 90 acres, 15 acres of which is a parcel labeled on the handout 13-82. It's highlighted in yellow on the second page of your handout. That's a 15-acre piece, and then the other yellow highlighted area on the handout comprise the other 75 acres that will be part of the protection. The first 15 acres we're looking to acquire. The other 75 acres will be a donated conservation restriction. The first page on your handout shows the proximity of the area that we're looking at off of Pomeroy Meadow in relation to a well, the Southampton drinking water well at Glendale Road. When the opportunity was presented to us, that area of town was known, or at least documented, in a 1987 geologic study that was done for the town of Southampton. And a lot of towns back then were doing this sort of study because contamination was showing up on drinking water wells throughout Massachusetts. And they wanted to know the recharge areas of each well. And in doing so, and finding out the recharge area of the town well, a lot of good geologic information was discussed and brought forth. And one of the key points in this study is that the area on the Pomeroy Meadow Road area, near the intersection of Walcott Road and Pomeroy Meadow Road, the old Konopka property, was a key area to protect, and the town should try to protect it if at all possible. And the possibility kind of presented itself to us back in July. In August, through Pioneer Valley Planning Commission and with Bob Newton, we asked, could you verify our understanding of this Warren study and the importance of this parcel? Because if we had misinterpreted this report, we didn't want to spend another minute chasing this, actually. But what Mr. Newton, Professor Newton pointed out was, yes, it's an area to protect. And he's going to give a presentation tonight on the overall aquifer and the geology that formed years ago here, the Zone 2, which covers a lot of the area of Southampton, and then kind of keying in, I think, Bob, a little bit into this area that we're discussing up off of Pomeroy Meadow Road. So, without further ado.
Did that count against me? Okay, so I told I have about 20 minutes, so as a professor, I only talk in 50-minute blocks. So I'm going to try to go through this, and I encourage you to ask any questions at any time. Okay, so don't feel you have to wait to the end if there's some question. Can we turn off that first set of lights so that we don't get the glare on the screen? All right, so to start out with, what is an aquifer? Just shout out the answer.
Underground water supply.
Yeah, it has a technical definition of any geologic formation that yields usable quantities of water, and so it's very open. But anything you can get water out of is an aquifer, so we want to keep that in mind. And we all know about the Barnes Aquifer And the Southampton part of the is part of that Barnes aquifer system, and it's shown in yellow here. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how it formed, and a little bit about how recharge occurs. And I've done a little extra research to look at some of the things in the area where the land is that you're thinking about protecting. And I'm going to show you why it is an important area. And finally, I'm going to just say very briefly at the end a little bit about how water sources in Massachusetts are now under stress. And, you know, we think we have infinite water supply, you know, we get lots of rain, but we do not. And I think we have to be very careful to protect our water supply, or we won't have it to protect. So starting with just a regional view of the topography, we have on the right side that mountain range, which is the Holyoke Range, or Mount Tom Range here as it goes north-south. And then on the other side, you see this highland areas, those lighter colors or higher elevations. And then we have the valley in the middle. And that's where the aquifer is. If we look in at Southampton, is this it? Do we have a pointer? If we look in at Southampton, we see areas here like these flat areas here and up here, which this is the one of more interest. The well is right there. And these are deposits of sand and gravel that are going to make up the aquifer. So this is a geologic map, and what's in yellow are the materials that we associate with the aquifer. They're sands and gravels that were deposited by meltwater streams. And in blue, we see deposits that are much finer grained, that are lake deposits formed in lakes. And how those are related are really important to the whole story. So we start out, geologists going to say something about how did the aquifer form? It formed as a result of glaciation. This is the area of the Laurentide ice sheet. And the numbers represent thousands of years. So if you look at the 18,000 there, that's at 18,000 years ago, that's the limit of the ice. And you see how in time at 9,000 years ago, it had come back almost to Hudson Bay, and by 6,000 years ago, it's just about done. So this is the process associated with the melting of this huge continental scale ice sheet that created the aquifer. Deposits. There are two kinds of deposits from the glacier. There's this glacial till shown here on the left, and we see it's unsorted, unstratified, doesn't have any layers in it that you can see, has all different sized material, and you're all probably familiar with this type of material. This is deposited directly by the ice, and this is normally not what we think of for municipal aquifers. If you have your house up in the hills, you might have a dug well that would be dug into this material, and you'd get some water out of it, maybe enough water. It also has a lot of variability. It's kind of what I call a dog's breakfast. It can be many different things in different places, so it doesn't all look exactly like this. But the deposits that we associate with the Barnes aquifer are these meltwater stream deposits. So here we see a glacier, we see a river coming out the front of it. Here, if we look downstream from the glacier, we see all this wonderful sand and gravel, well-sorted material. This is what's going to become the aquifer. And it's stratified. You can see it has layers. It's sorted. You can see there are gravel layers, there are sand layers, gravel layers. This is the meltwater stream deposits that are forming the aquifer. And if it's well-sorted material, like on the left, in block A, you see it's all about the same size, and it has big pore spaces. So it has a lot of porosity, lots of places to put water. If it's not well sorted, if it's like the glacial till, the fines fill in the space between the course, and there's not much porosity and not much permeability. It doesn't move through it as well either. So that those meltwater stream deposits are going to make better aquifers than the glacial till. We talk about the water table. The water table just represents the boundary between the zone of saturation and the zone of aeration. And we can forget the diagram on the right, which is supposed to represent fracture porosity, but we're only interested in the stuff on the left, sorry. And you can see that we have, that's the water table, that's where the water is that we're gonna use. Whoops, wrong button. The last thing we have to worry about is those glacial lake deposits. This is the Mendenhall Glacier in Alaska, and in front of many glaciers associated with all the melting of the ice, you have lakes. And we have Mendenhall Lake. We did a little project out there looking at the nature of sediments and how water was coming into the lake. And if you look at those lake sediments, they look like this. They're alternate layers of clay and silty sand, and each couplet, clay, silty sand layer, represents 1 year of deposition in the lake. This is the lake deposits. It doesn't make a good aquifer. It's too fine-grained. Water has too much difficulty flowing through it. So this is not a good aquifer, even though it's stratified and sorted. So let's talk about how the Barnes Aquifer was formed. And so we're looking here at a sort of conceptual diagram, and north would be on the left side, and south would be on the right side. And we have the front of the glacier. And if the glacier stood in one place for a long period of time, then it's going to collect sediment at the snout or at the end of the glacier. And so all those meltwater streams are going to pile up sediment until it actually emerges above the lake and forms a delta. And then there'll be lake sediments off to the side. And so that's what happened here. There was a time when the ice front stood in about where we are, about in this area right here, for long enough to build up those flat plains of sand and gravel. And then it started melting back. And as it thinned and melted back, there was still meltwater coming into the lake from the bottom of the glacier. So you still get deposition of sand and gravel here. It just doesn't build up all the way to the surface. So you get a layer of sand and gravel right at the bottom of the lake, right at the front of the glacier. As the front of the glacier moves back, it just becomes a longer and longer area of sand and gravel that's attached to that thicker zone. And then, of course, the lake sediments accumulate, and the lake sediments fall on top of the sand and gravel. So you have this impermeable lake sediment, and beneath it you have the permeable sand and gravel, and then you have this high area where you can recharge that system. So here's a little conceptual diagram, and you see we have the clay off here, we have the sand and gravel exposed at the surface here, and everything to the right of this dashed red line would represent the recharge area, because the sand and gravel is exposed at the surface, so when it rains, it all infiltrates in. And then that water is moving off in this direction, and any rainwater that's falling here is just running as surface runoff. If you were to drill a well in the clay, well, if you were in the clay, you don't get a useful quantity of water. But if you punch through into the sand and gravel, then the water will actually rise in the well, in this case, up to this level here, and this would be what we call the tensiometric surface. You'd be tapping this aquifer here. But this aquifer here is being recharged over here. There's no recharge occurring right next to the well. That's really important for us to understand. And in some places, that tensiometric surface can actually be above ground level. So you punch your well in. This is an Easthampton well, and I drilled a hole in the cap. I did that in 1980 something, and it's still spraying water up. Okay, so you don't need a pump. Water just comes out. This is true artesian flow, and it's because the water is confined by the clay, and the aquifer's below the clay. Now, I put this diagram in here because this is another way to think about it. It's a little bit different from that north-south view. This is an east-west view, and this is more like the aquifer that you've tapped into with the Southampton well. You have the clay right here, and you're tapping into the sand and gravel, and then you have the sand and gravel exposed out here to recharge, and then you have this glacial till. And I want you to look at this diagram a little carefully, because I'm going to use this in reference to the 1978 report. 87, sorry. I switched those numbers. So the way this formed is first the glacier's covering the whole area, and you have bedrock, and you have glacial till being deposited. Now I have purposely made this asymmetric, so that there's more till on the left side than on the right side, which clearly can happen. And although the till doesn't make a good aquifer, water does flow through it. As I said, if you dug a well in there, you'd probably get some useful water. And then, of course, the glacier shrunk, and now you're looking at this cross-section like this. And for a while, you had the glacier sitting in the bottom of the valley, sort of blocking everything, and you have these two little valleys on either side of the ice, where I've labeled the one on the left with meltwater stream. And that meltwater stream is depositing sand and gravel. There's your sand and gravel deposits on both sides. And then when it melts away, you have just the glacial lake putting the fine grain cap on the aquifer. And so the lake is depositing those lake sediments, which are fine grained. Okay, so that's sort of the physiological setup there of how the landscapes, physiography setup of the landscape, and how it got that way. A little bit on the hydrologic cycle, really important for us to think about. When it rains, water hits the ground, it has a choice. It can either move as surface runoff or it can infiltrate. What determines whether it will infiltrate or run off will be how permeable the soil is. That's number one. Number two, that determines whether it's going to run off or infiltrate is how high the water table is. Because if the water table is right at the surface, it doesn't matter how permeable it is, the water's not going to go in. It has no place to go. It's just going to run off. So we have this runoff versus infiltration, and that's sort of the key thing. If it infiltrates and it gets to the soil water, and then if we're lucky enough that enough comes into the soil water and we don't have enough evapotranspiration to use it all up, some of it will actually get down to the groundwater and recharge the groundwater, which will then flow to some point of outlet, usually a stream, to provide base flow of the stream. So this is how we might expect a river to operate if there's no clay. So it's just in sand, and we have the hills on either side being the recharge area, and the river being the discharge area. And so even though the river is flowing in permeable material, rain that falls on the river doesn't infiltrate. It is carried as surface runoff. It can't go because the water is coming up at the river. All right, so again, we'll start looking at the geology. You've seen this before. I got some of the wells. You can see the Southampton well being in the blue. The blue is the clays. The tan color, I guess, I don't know. The light tan color is the stratified sands and gravels. This is that 1987 report, and it shows the well, and it shows these different units, and this this thin unit here is the glacial till. This W3 they call glacial fluvial deposits, mainly sand, and this is sand and gravel, and then this is the clay, and it's just what we just saw, only in this one particular example like this. Now I want to emphasize that they show the till as being very thin. And so if that's the case, you're not going to have much recharge there. What you're going to be interested in here is that where that W3 is exposed. That's what you want to, that area where the sand and gravel is exposed, away from the till, away from the clay. That's the area. So it doesn't matter. Close to the well, there's no recharge. It's that distant area. So looking at it again in our little model here, our conceptual model, we have the thick till on the left, and I'm going to show you why I know it's thick till on the western side in a moment. And then the dashed line would represent the water table. And you'd see the primary recharge area being where it says aquifer, sand, and gravel, a smaller one on the right side. And the till here would also be a significant recharge because it's thick and the water table's far below the surface. Let's look at the situation. These were the parcels that I looked at. And Kurt, I don't...
Yeah, if you can all read up there, 1382, it's the box or the parallelogram furthest to the right.
Yeah.
Y'all see that 1382?
And I think you can all see from the physiography that, hey, this is the flat surface that we associate with those terraces. This is the sand and gravel. Out here, the red spot is the well, and that's in the clay. So the recharge is occurring here. Okay? The other thing I've put on this diagram is the white numbers. So those green dots represent well logs that have been, for wells that have been drilled since 2000, the year 2000. The reason why I used the wells since 2000 is that there was a program done by the state geologist, Steve Mabey, did a program starting in the early 2000s where he required all well drillers in Massachusetts to attend a workshop to learn how to log wells, and they had to be certified because they could do it. So since that time, the quality of well logs is really good. And those white numbers represent the depth to bedrock. The depth to bedrock, 60 feet, 70 feet, 50 feet, 31, 57. Even though, if we were just looking at the physiography, we'd say, you know what, parcel 1247, for the most part, it's kind of marginal. But because that parcel is what we now see is in thick till, it's also providing significant recharge.
And Bob, Kristen, 1247 is part of the 75 acres that the Madsen family is considering donating. Kristen, that's right? Kristen Madsen? Yeah. And also part of 1379, right? 1379. Yeah. So those two parcels, along with 1382.
So what I'm saying is that when I first looked at the area, I chose the sand and gravel deposits as primary recharge areas. You really want to save them. And in that letter I wrote, I probably said, well, those is the other areas are secondary recharge area, good to preserve, but may not be that much recharge. Now I'm pretty sure there's a lot of recharge. Look very carefully. There's not stream channels in that area. There are no stream channels in that area because the water's not running off. It's infiltrating because there's thick superficial sediments. And I just put in one of these well log reports reporting depth to bedrock, which I can't even read there, but it's 70 feet, I think, in that one. And the other one is the depth to water, which is also, I think, 70 feet or something like that. It's deep to water in both. I think I have that in this next one. And just to show you, so I had two profiles there. I had an AB profile and the CD. We were just talking about the CD profile, and we have these little terraces that we can see, but they're not really the classic like the AB one. That flat surface is really a great place for sand and gravel and a lot of recharge there. Here we're looking at, let's see, this is, that's depth. I guess I put the depth in twice, which I didn't mean to do. All right, so wait a minute, don't go to the conclusion quite yet. We can do it. So the other thing is to look at depth to water, and in all those areas where it's deep to bedrock, it's also deep to water. Now it's a little fuzzy there because they cased the upper part of the well, so there's not really good communication with the surface water with the bedrock aquifer. But I think that the trend I think there is that there's potential recharge there as well. Now, the next thing is this Sustainable Water Management Initiative, which maybe you have heard of, maybe you haven't heard of, but it's a Massachusetts program looking at withdrawals of groundwater and what it's doing to the streams. And just to show you that in Southampton, you're at least not in this half, but in the other half, you're in an area where they've targeted as a potential problem that too much groundwater is being taken out. And so what you need to do is to make sure that you don't take out any more water in these red areas especially. So there's a lot of stress on the aquifer, And so I think by the things I'd like to tell you or convince you of is that the two things. And one is that aquifer recharge can occur outside the area of the aquifer. That's really, really important. It's especially important given the stresses our aquifers are under with regard to chemical contamination. We all know about Westfield and PFOS. You might think it's all coming from the Air Force. I spent part of last week in New Hampshire helping 2 towns that have PFOS in their wells from their landfills. So it's coming from landfills. We don't know why it's in the landfills. It's not associated with firefighting foam, but it's in the landfills, it's bleeding out of the landfills, and it's a problem. So as we look more and more, we're finding more and more of that out there. And I think anything we can do to protect recharge areas is going to help us maintain high water quality. And the other point that I would make is that the water resources are under increasing stress, and we tend to think we have unlimited water in western Massachusetts. We do not. Eastern Massachusetts in the 1950s and 1960s was just like this. But they built on the recharge areas. They withdrew too much water. They dried up the Ipswich River. You know, it's a big problem. Even though precipitation's increasing, we're seeing that there's less and less groundwater availability. So that's it. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Most of Southampton was in the
Before you do that, John, or Christina, you mind going up there so everybody can hear you? It's being recorded, sorry.
Introduce yourself, sure.
Christina Madsen, Rattle Hill Road. I'm wondering, almost all of Southampton shows that it's in a stressed area for water. Can you say why?
Well, I don't want to get too involved with swimming because there are a lot of different issues associated with it. But the problem is that you take water out and it doesn't go into the streams. So they're looking at basically how much water is being withdrawn versus what the flow of the stream is.
So is that Southampton residents' use, or is it being overused?
Well, so that's the concern is that, and I would say most of Southampton's not in the critical zone.
Okay.
So I wouldn't say that Southampton is in that critical zone, but some of it is, but not the half where your well is. But it is in an area of concern. So I think that it's not just whether you're going to run your well dry. What it is are you going to run the river dry? Are you going to start harming the fish and other biota in the river by taking more water out? So that's the concern.
There's another question. The property we're looking at, the 15 acres, 1382, was recently perked. They're divided into 5 lots. And all 5 perks, as deep as they could dig, which is 10 or 12 feet, the arm of a backhoe, showed sand, you know, in every one of those deep holes. So, like you say, that's
it's a primary recharge area, and I hope you can see. All you have to do is look at that digital elevation model. You can tell that's what it is. You don't have to go out there, and we could make that prediction and be right most of the time, just by looking at the landscape.
And the 90 acres that is of interest here on the water side is to protect our drinking water. There's 90 acres of protected land that's in a really distinct recharge area to our well. You know, the swimmy thing is kind of secondary in a way, you know, but we're protecting our well source, our drinking water source. And this action helps us protect it.
Yeah, in the long run, it will help you with swimming too, because we want you to maintain the recharge that you're on.
Do you want to explain how we're going to acquire the land on Pomeroy Meadow, just in case people don't know?
Sure. I mean, the objective.
Come up closer to his mic because he's.
Yep, I'm sorry. You don't have these in the highway garage. The acquisition of the 90 acres, really first and foremost, was with Christina Madsen and her family saying that, you know, they want to partner with us on if this is an area to protect to begin with, and we kind of screened that and decided, whether we thought it was or wasn't, and we're pretty convinced it is a good area to protect. It started there, and with it was the Konopka property had gone into probate, or there's going to be a transfer of ownership, and it was a good time for us to talk to the new owners. That land had been in Chapter 61B, I believe, or 61A, and therefore it'd be coming out of 61A, and there's a very tight timeline to acquire that. So we want to be in front of that process if we could. The right of first refusal process has not started yet, but what we've done is looked at the 15 acres, have a sense of what the property is worth, 5 building lots in Southampton, and applied for a grant, a $212,000 grant from the state of Massachusetts to help pay part of the acquisition cost. An estimate on the acquisition cost could be a range of anywhere from $500,000 to $600,000, possibly in that range. We asked for 210. We would have asked for more, but the maximum grant is 300,000, and we were limited to 212,000 on our application. Therefore, we needed 400,000, 430,000 or so, and we went to Community Preservation Committee in January, presented the idea, what we'd like to do, the 90 acres of drinking water protection, have met with them in February and March. They are receptive to supporting that. They will take a vote in April to finalize their decision, I believe, but we briefed them on our need to get another 400,000. If the grant does not come through, we may need 600,000 from CPC. Does that answer the question? So we won't know. Well, we'll know if we get the grant, the $210,000 grant, sometime in March, supposedly. So this time next month, we'll know where we stand.
And just to clarify, you were saying 90 acres. It's 15 acres that we're going to purchase, and the Mattson family has agreed to give a conservation restriction on their 75 acres, which they're going to keep ownership of, but it will stay undeveloped, so it'll be still a recharge area, correct?
Protects our drinking water.
Right.
Yes.
So thank you again for that.
So you'll be seeing that come up at town meeting in May. There'll be an article, community preservation, putting forth an article for between 430,000 and 630,000 to help us acquire this first 15 acres, which then leverages us getting the additional 75 conservation restriction.
Right.
Can you go back to the map that actually has the red area where it says that the area in Southampton, which is the most kind of at risk?
That's because of all the Easthampton wells, though, probably. They're all drilled on the northern section. Is that why it's being considered critical? Because there's a ton of withdrawal from it?
There is, yes. And Westfield also.
I mean,
But
Westfield on
that's
the
the
southern
primary reason why?
Yeah, I think that's the reason why. So they're looking at Broad Brook in the Easthampton side. Broad Brook is the one of concern. And then, I can't remember what the ponds there that drain on the other side. And so that by the way that the swimming program calculates things, they are concluding that there's too much water being withdrawn.
Yeah, and you have Easthampton's wells up in the northern section of that. There's like 4, how many are there? There's gotta be 4 or 5 of them. Then you got a
So
Holyoke one and a Westfield one.
Yeah, and I would just add one other thing here that I think is really the key point I would make is that, Easthampton was permitted for like 6 million gallons per day at one point. They felt they could pump even more, and the state's going to come back and say, well, and now they're only pumping 3 because all the mills have shut down and they're not using as much water. So even less than that, I think they're down to like 1.5.
Okay.
And that's still too much under this new way of looking at things. So there's a change in the way we look at how much water we can take from groundwater. It's a change in the way we look at things, and it's a direct result of what happened in Eastern Mass, primarily with the Ipswich River, in that they took so much water out that they dried the river up.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that the Open Space Review Committee is doing is trying to look at, first we started by looking at the Glendale property, and then this area came up. And I think one of the criticisms is that we're not having more of a broader look. We're just kind of like going after sort of incidental things that happen to come up on sale or whatever. Is there any priority you know, scale that can look at not just, I guess, not just water, but natural resources and
Yeah.
what would be?
I think that you know, that's a really good question. And, you know, from my perspective, there are a couple reasons why you want to protect the recharge areas. To me, the most important thing is to prevent chemical contamination of your water. The second one is to prevent the loss of recharge. You know, maybe those things could be close to be the same importance, but those are really, really important things. And so I would say that I would argue that the first places to look are the primary recharge areas. That is where those sand and gravel deposits are.
And I think that's an important term about primary recharge area, that you and I are talking, the gravel deposits. That term is used elsewhere in the entire zone too.
Well, I think
Can you show
it's
us?
a mistake to consider, to always just be talking about the zone 2. It's a very short-sighted way of looking at things. The zone 2 is particularly for that one well. You know, as Southampton grows, you may need to put another well in. Where are you going to put it? You'll have to have another zone 2 will be defined. You don't want to use up all your zone 2s now, all the potential groundwater now. You want to protect as much of that aquifer as you can. So I think it's a bad idea to concentrate just on the zone 2. I mean, the zone 2 is protecting that well. But if you're looking to the future, you're going to have to look at all your water needs to the future. So I would say that. But looking at this diagram, the primary recharge areas are the sand and gravels, high sand and gravel. You don't even have to worry about the area directly around the well in this particular case, because it's clay, and there's upward movement of water. So even if you were to contaminate the surface, it's going up and going out the river. So this is not that important. This is the important areas, and sometimes it's hard for people to conceive the areas further away from the well are more important than the areas close to the well. And that's really, it's all because this is protecting this area naturally. You know, the Maloney well in Easthampton is located by the factories, and it's you know, the state has always been concerned about it, but it's under 100 feet of clay. I mean, the average 100 feet of clay there. It's not nearly as vulnerable as these areas off to the south. So the first priority is to protect everything you possibly can in these high recharge areas of what I call primary recharge areas. And then up here, I wouldn't worry too much about this is what we would call a secondary recharge area. And this one is, you know, what happens to water falling near that tree, rain falling near that tree? If it can't infiltrate, it runs as runoff. And some of that runoff will actually go through some of these deposits and be lost. The stream will go into the groundwater. Those are recharge areas, and they're kind of important. But that would be the least of my ones I would worry about. I would consider this much more important because it potentially can actually get a lot of water. It would be really interesting for us to figure out how much water is recharging through that area. It could be quite a bit moving through the system. But this would be primary importance. That would be secondary. That would be tertiary. And I wouldn't worry so much about that.
And that could all be within, all be within the zone 2. A lot of our zone 2 has has a lake and silt deposits.
The trouble with your zone 2 is it includes this
It
area.
includes that area. So just because it's in the zone 2,
Doesn't mean it's
they're not equal. The
No,
sand and gravel-
absolutely not. That's why I don't like the idea of just looking at the zone 2.
Diana Fetterman, 3 Birchwood Drive. I'm just wondering if the water board or the superintendent could give us an idea of what capacity we're at, how much water we're using, and how much, you know, leeway we have before we run out, or how much it's grown in recent years, anything like that.
I don't have the specific numbers off the top of my head, but if you look at our annual reports, we're pretty much at our withdrawal limits, the DEP permits. And that's the primary driver between our agreement with Easthampton to build a connection with their system and get a secondary source of supply via Easthampton. So the one well that Mr. Newton's been speaking of, and that Kurt and myself and Tom and the commission manage, is pretty much you could consider at capacity now, both mechanically and yielding wise.
Matt, can you also speak to the other well and the Topography?
The other well,
We did have another well.
but there's two wells in the same location. I consider that one well because it's really not a redundant well. It's not on the other side of town. It's not in another recharge area. But we do have another well casing at that same location on Glendale. The Topography Reservoir, as many of you know, occupies, along with its watershed, a majority of the western part of Southampton. When Holyoke came into town to install that reservoir, they were given legislative approval to do that, and the people of Southampton stood up and said, if you're going to take the water, you really need to give us some rights to that water over time. So we do, in fact, have rights to water that comes out of the Topography Reservoir, and at one point in time, that was our primary source of water. The issue with surface water versus groundwater is the level of treatment that the water has to go through before it can go into the system. So the surface water treatment systems are very, very expensive. You're talking treatment plants that are a couple $1 million. Currently, Holyoke is using a UV system that they installed a couple years ago to the tune of, I think, like $15 million to upgrade their current plant just to include more treatment. So although Southampton has rights to that water, we've estimated the cost of installing a treatment plant to be in the range of $5 to $7 million. You know, the next logical question may be, why can't we connect directly to Holyoke and just buy water like we are from Easthampton? Holyoke fluoridates their water, or Easthampton does it, Southampton doesn't. So we would have to get town meeting approval, Board of Health approval to accept fluoridated water. And you know, we as the Water Commission determined that a $1 million pump station that we could draw from Easthampton immediately was more valuable to the town than either of those two other options.
So I guess just to follow up, since we're talking about Topography, if it's $5 to $7 million, did we figure out if we did a debt exclusion for 20 or 30 years, what it would bring on the rate of the individual homeowner? To see if it was worthwhile?
We didn't do that analysis.
Would that make sense to do that for the long-term future? Because Easthampton is limited to what we can draw from, and it seems like at least going forward, it'd be nice to know that if it adds 10 cents per quarter on the individual tax rate, if we amortize it over 20 or 30 years, we can plan for that and start the process now, because I'm assuming it takes years to build a plant.
Right. Yeah, we can certainly go down that path. Again, like I said, the decisions that we made a couple years ago and are outlined in the master plan sort of steered us away from that for a variety of reasons. One is the upfront and the operating cost of that plant. I think the operating cost of the plant alone, the additional personnel, was north of $200,000. So right now we operate at about, I think our budget's somewhere around $650,000, $700,000. So you're looking at a pretty significant rate increase just for the operation of that plant. And again, significant maybe 20 to 30% of the current rates. I don't know. We would have to do a study, a detailed study on that, but the initial high-level math didn't quite make sense.
Was the agreement with Holyoke, did that allow a certain amount to be drawn by Southampton? Was that just an allowance, or was there a discounted ability, you know, is it translated into funds, or is it just you're allowed to withdraw a certain amount of water, whereas that agreement doesn't currently exist or didn't in Easthampton?
So it's actually written into the legislation. The cap is, I think, 650,000 gallons a day. It's so much per person or that cap. So there was some foresight in that if Southampton grew, they would still be capped at that certain amount. Mm-hmm. Easthampton, again, we entered into an intermunicipal agreement with them 2 years ago when we decided that was the route we were going to go, and we agreed upon a cap at that time with them for up to a maximum of 20 years. So that was based on their conditions, their permit, and their hydraulic analysis.
So the agreement we have with Easthampton is for 20 years? You said you entered the agreement 2
Correct.
years ago. Is it for a 20-year period?
Correct.
Didn't we at one, I might be confusing the two things, but didn't we have an interconnection with Holyoke at one point in time that had to be shut down? And was that because of fluoridation, or wasn't there an interconnection there at one point in time that's no longer, that would take a while to reconnect, or?
Right, there's two connection points today that in theory we could connect up to. One is on Pequot Road, the other one is on Gilbert Road. And they basically connect to the, I think it's a 48-inch or 42-inch main that runs from Tycomedy up and over the hill to their treatment plant. We were connected to that. That was a source of supply. And then we switched, or we came off of that supply and used the well as our primary source. We had an issue 5 or 6 years ago with coliform hits, and basically we concluded that some of those hits were likely coming from the connection. We still had a physical connection in those points. The hydraulic gradient was higher in those locations than our system, so we were under the opinion that the water was backfeeding from the Holyoke system into our system and causing contamination. So that was the reason we severed the actual connections between Holyoke and our system.
Yeah, I also see here that with the Tycomedy, we're limited to, it's 125 gallons per inhabitant, a maximum of 625,000 gallons per day, or 228 million gallons per year. What is our annual usage roughly?
That's what the Tycomedy or Carl?
This is what we could take out of the Tycomedy according to the.
Right, I think I was saying 640, it's 625, but we're at 1.3 per day.
Well, our annual varies, but this past year it was about 111 million gallons.
111 million.
Annually.
300, 400,000 a day.
Okay, so this is, the max we could use out of the Tycomedy is 228 million annually.
That's
according to
raw
this.
that's raw
Right,
water, Jim.
right.
That's not treated water.
That's raw water, correct.
Raw
I
water.
So
understand.
it's
Yes.
a little over double what we're
Yep.
doing today.
We could use it to fill swimming pools or something, Jim, but, you know,
okay.
if for drinking water, we gotta add a lot of money to meet the
Yeah, I
drinking water.
Barbara, excuse me, Barbara LaFlamme, 20 Cook Road. Given the situation that the water commissioners find themselves in, being so close to the maximum maximum usage in Southampton, have there been any plans to restrict water use? For example, lawns, that type of usage? Because at some point, we may get to the point where there won't be enough water just for household and bathing and cooking kind of usage.
Yeah, we've currently entered into several voluntary water restrictions. The difference between a voluntary and a mandatory restriction is DEP has to actually approve the conditions of the mandatory. And again, we haven't gotten to the level where we determined that it was required to have a mandatory water restriction in place.
Are you getting good cooperation? Have you seen the difference in the drawdown since you've instituted the voluntary usage?
I would say that the usage has steadied as opposed to come down. So instead of a continued upward peak with development and with water usage, we've seen a leveling off, and I think part of that is our, for lack of a better term, our meter inspection program, our finding accounts that weren't previously metered and metering them. So through those combination of efforts, we've seen a leveling of the water usage.
Okay, thank you.
Is there? No, what I'm thinking of, is there any collaboration with the building department? There are new systems, when people build houses, to repurpose and reuse water, let's say bath water, washing machine water, for things that are non-consuming, like washing your car or doing, watering your lawn, those kinds of things, a way of reusing water as a means of conserving the main supply that we need for human consumption.
So I think, in my opinion, the way to attack and get to that end is through some strong local regulation, which currently is not in place. The Massachusetts Building Code does not require any of that.
Right.
So for us to enforce a plan like that, the town would have to develop those regulations and enforce them. Quite frankly, that's beyond the capabilities of the staff at the water department to
Right.
undertake a project like that.
I understand, but, I mean, it's gonna be one or the other. We've got to figure out a way, and that could be one approach. I understand what you're saying, it's beyond your scope, but trying to figure out a way of how we might approach it and might get there, even on a voluntary basis, rather than mandatory.
Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, we use a relatively low amount of gallons per capita per day in Southampton, don't we? I mean, the target or the goal, maybe 60 gallons per person per day, and we're pretty close to that.
We're close to it, we're below it at this point, but that fluctuates as well. I mean,
Summertime, yeah, the summertime peak period, that goes up. People are water their lawns at night.
Can I ask another question? Are you done?
Yes, I am.
So the land there is slated to possibly be 5 houses at 3 acres apiece, and is there a way to compute the difference in the water from having 3 houses that draw water for their household use compared to the leaving it as is for recharge?
Well, I'm not sure, I guess I'll say I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'm not sure we're concerned about what those 3 houses are going to draw versus having those houses in place and losing the
right.
rechargeability of that land.
Maybe you can't compute the usage, but what would be the net effect of the difference in the amount of water to preserve by not having it? Is that computable?
I think well, my understanding is the primary concern is not having 5 individual houses over 3 acres of land, but it's the bigger picture of both parcels on both sides of the road.
Okay.
So you could have a multi-unit subdivision in a cluster format or whatnot, similar to what we already have in that area. And I think that amount of impervious surface would make a significant difference to the recharge in that area.
You talking about the 15 acres or the total of 90?
The total of 90. Yeah. Mr. Newton, I think Kurt tried to impress upon the group that the 15 acres is the catalyst to the rest of it.
Right.
So.
So you have to get the 15.
Pardon? We have to get the 15 before we get the 75 conservation restriction, right?
I have an additional question, follow-up. I was just talking with Jim over here. I mean, if you could go back to that map that shows the red, I think that would...
Which one?
The map that shows where the red is, basically, where
Yes.
we're withdrawing too much water. And in talking with Jim over here, I guess my concern, I have no concern. Yeah, go back one more.
Yeah.
Want that light off?
No, I think that's fine. I mean, what would be great is actually to place the wells on that map, but if you kind of marry the 2 maps together, I mean, our town well is obviously outside of the red. And that's and that's our primary source of drinking water for the town. And then our interconnection is in Easthampton, which, to my knowledge, all of their wells, or most of their wells, are on Hendrick Street, which are all well within that red area. And so I guess I'm overly concerned that perhaps if our well were to ever get contaminated or we ever needed to get more water from Easthampton, we're pulling from a source that's already pretty troubled to begin with, and I'm not really sure they can handle our capacity.
Whether that's troubled source or not. I mean, the numbers are such that Easthampton has a surplus of water that they can use.
Okay.
The water management act, like Professor Moon said, was something like 6 million. They're using 1.5. They've got water. They've got a lot of water to deliver to an adjacent community. That's one of the advantages of looking at them. It's very comparable to our water in our well, so there's not a lot of mixing different kinds of water that could
Sure.
have concerns with lead copper and that sort of thing.
I guess where I was just going is just a backup plan, right? I mean, I'm worried about that being our backup plan.
Well, I mean, it's something to put on the radar screen, but we're not overly worried that Easthampton can't deliver us the water we need. You know, our maximum day, we need 700,000 gallons a day, maybe. We touch a million, maybe 700,000. Easthampton can deliver us 700,000 gallons a day, over and above what they're using, and still be well within their permits.
What's our surcharge? I used to live on the Easthampton line, and it was 100% surcharge. Is it high?
Our surcharge?
Yeah.
No, the agreement states that we pay 85% of the retail rate.
Oh, that's good.
So if their rates go up, our rates do too as well. We essentially become a customer of Easthampton at a discounted rate.
And it's only when we need them, you know.
right.
We want to take our wells off and rehabilitate the streams. We can't do that now.
Yeah.
We get the Easthampton connection, we can do that.
Christina Madsen, Rattle Hill. So I am confused now because Professor Newton has indicated that that is, those are areas of concern, and you're saying that there is ample water. Could you just discuss that? Thank you.
I was going to go there too.
So, the Massachusetts SWMI program, Sustainable Water Management Initiative, is a new initiative, and it's looking at surface water. And some of us don't think that it's quite works the way they want it to work, because like the Southampton well, many of the Easthampton wells are also in a confined aquifer where the groundwater is not directly connected to the river above. It's actually connected to the Connecticut River. And so does it really work there or not? I think there's a lot that has to happen. I mean, I think that this is a new program. I think it's really important for us to understand that people are looking at water not just by the old way, which says we could pump 6.5 million gallons per day and not run out of water. So that's why there's this difference. And you know, Easthampton clearly has the water to supply Southampton with no problem whatsoever. And it's a question of, well, is that really degrading the Broad Brook or not? And I think that's an open question that hasn't really been answered. And the state came out with this program. Some of us are not sure that the broad brush that they're using to determine what's red and what's not is the proper way to do it. But I do think that there is a new awareness that there is a connection between the groundwater and the surface water, and by pumping too much groundwater, you will potentially impact surface water in some situations. So I think it's a little unclear now exactly how that's all going to work its way out. It's good for us to understand that that's an issue, but I don't think that I would be making any decisions based on that red or not. I think, quite frankly, I think you're better off with the Easthampton connection than almost any other alternative that you have. And I would say one other thing, when you're looking at those individual, you know, do we build houses there or not? How much is that going to impact the recharge? I just completed a study in a rural area of New Hampshire, and the largest stratified drift aquifer in New Hampshire, the Ospey Aquifer, and we looked at almost 100 wells. They don't have municipal water, it's all residential water. We found 10% of those wells had measurable volatile organic compounds, benzene from gasoline, and they weren't above the MCL. They weren't above the maximum contaminant level allowed by the federal government, the EPA. But why is it there? These were residential areas. And I think one of the things we're seeing, we're going to do a follow-up study to see if it's actually increasing. But where you have people, you have contaminants that go into the aquifer. You have people, oh, I got some extra, I cleaned some of my car. I have to admit, when I was a teenager, I did this. rebuilt an engine, used gasoline to clean the parts, and then dumped the gas in the ground. And it doesn't take very much because you're talking about parts per billion to contaminate the water. And so I really believe if you have people, you're gonna have a significant risk of contamination. If it's just a little bit, it's okay. Dilution is the solution to pollution. But if you get too much, too many people, then you've got a problem.
Any other questions for Professor Newton?
I guess, John LeBrie Valley Road. I guess one question I have is on the conservation restriction. What are the details on that? How does it work? Are there any,
We
does
haven't,
it expire?
we haven't scratched the surface. I'll let you finish your question, I'm sorry.
But does it expire? Are there time limits? Can it be revoked?
It will be a permanent restriction.
It's not been negotiated, but you just heard it from the representative of the Mattson family, so.
Does that get taken care of in a deed, or how's it? I don't know.
Yeah, that'll be taken care of in the process we go forward, but we gotta acquire the 15 acres first.
I understand.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? So I think you got your 55-minute class in there.
I kept it to almost 20 minutes. I hope you
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Appreciate it.
Welcome.
Did you folks want to say anything about this?
I want to thank Professor Newton for his time and his education to the entire community.
Yes, and it'll be up on ECAT probably later tonight or tomorrow, so everybody can review it again if they have any other questions.
And I am always available if you have questions, and I'm happy to answer at any time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
He said if you give them the files, you can build it into the recording.
Okay.
Okay, going on with the select board agenda, our next meeting is March 19th, which is next Tuesday. Now we have open time for the public. Does anybody want to come up and speak on anything unrelated to what we've talked about already? Identify yourself.
Tamara Lunas, 298 College Highway. Can you tell us where we stand with the pump or building or whatever it was that was happening at Tractor Supply Big Line?
We certainly can. We had a meeting today with the consultant to go over the final design elements of the building and the actual pumps. I forget the date, but we did secure the easement some time ago. We are doing the paperwork with the Clean Water Trust now to finalize the loan agreement. So to summarize, we anticipate, we're well on our way. We anticipate breaking ground this construction season and finishing hopefully before the end of the calendar year.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, if not, the select board's going to go into executive session and we won't be coming out. Going in under Mass General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 21A, Number 6, to consider the purchase, exchange, lease, or value of real estate if the chair declares that an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the negotiating position of the public body. It's regards to 68 Pomeroy Meadow Road, and it's going to be a joint meeting with the water commissioners. I need a motion from the select board to go into executive session.
So moved.
A second?
Second.
Okay, roll call vote, please.
Groden, aye.
Roland, aye.
LeBrie, aye.
Martin, aye. We're going to take a 5-minute break.